Hi everybody. Today we're going to be talking about chapter 1 from your textbook, and I will remind you that we are using the 7th edition of Literacy for the 21st Century, and I am of course asking that you have access to that because you're going to be needing it when you're doing your quizzes and when you're doing some of your different little participation exercises and so forth whenever we're doing things with this class. But I always start out with the fact that a lot of people they keep seeing all throughout this book the word literacy, and they always start asking questions about are you a reading teacher, or are you a literacy teacher, or are you what? I'll stop there because the very definition of literacy is the ability or science to read and write. Did you hear that? It is the ability or science to read and write. And this whole course will be trying to drive home the importance of the two connected, the reading and the writing. A lot of teachers like to put the writing kind of to the side because they always talk about, oh, reading is so much more important. But we're going to be talking all semester long about how the two aren't separate of each other. They have to be taught together in order for true literacy to occur. And a really good place for you to start, I'll point out, would be page 1 of the textbook. And you'll hear me all throughout this semester on like these little videos talking about refer to your textbook, because I want you to mark places in your book to go back to that might be of benefit to you later on, whether it's on your quizzes, whether it's on our midterm, whether it's on something on down the road that you can make a connection to. That we're talking about when we get a little bit farther along. But on page 1, look at the very first sentence. We need our students to take ownership of their learning. And the very first sentence of the book says, classrooms are different today. They've become communities of learners where students assume more responsibility for learning. Now, never has there been a time when we didn't have to hope and pray that we had been teaching our children to take ownership of their learning than now, because throughout this pandemic that we have been in the middle of, the students themselves truly do have to take some ownership of their own learning. It's not about having a good parent who steps in and helps them. It's not about having a steadfast teacher who teaches wall to wall on the online for them. It's going to have to be that they take some ownership, and that's what your teaching has to lead them to, is ownership of their learning. And if you'll look down through here at these first pages, even just looking at the pictures at the very beginning of this chapter, I love looking at the pictures here because every single one of them shows students who have been taking ownership of their learning. And we're going to be coming back to that off and on all the way through this particular. This book also starts talking about a little bit of background information that you probably may have picked up in bits and pieces along the way as you got to this particular point in your education program. But it begins by talking about learning the uniqueness of the different age levels that you're going to be teaching in elementary. And an elementary teacher is certified all the way from 1st through 6th. Very often you will be called upon to maybe even teach above that, especially if you find yourself either in a private school area, or if you find yourself in a dependent K-8 school, or pre-K-8, I guess I should say. But the fact is, even if you are early childhood, you may be teaching 1st, 2nd, or 3rd grade at some point. So you need to know the uniqueness of the children as they're transitioning through this period. And one of the reasons that I like that it really focuses a lot on the transition from child to adolescence in 4th and 5th grades, well, partly it's because that's where my heart lies, but partly is this: it is a very real phenomenon, usually known as the 3rd grade slump, sometimes 4th grade slump, but you'll usually hear it referred to as the 3rd grade slump, where we start to lose them. It is the make or break time. You know, whenever kids first start reading, and they're so excited about reading, and they read the little thin books, and they want to read them like 10 times in one night. Well, along about 3rd grade, whenever they start transitioning to like longer chapter books, or having to do more reading in textbook type formats, we start to lose them, because they start to lose the joy. It starts becoming a little bit more difficult and takes longer, and it begins what we refer to as a slump. So it is important that we are aware of what's going on with kids as they're going through these particular changes. Also, we need to be aware of this. Our book breaks down literacy instruction into all of these different categories on here. 9 principles, as a matter of fact, altogether, but they break it down into active learning, the social interaction that kids need, the authentic activities, strategy, individualization, and inquiry learning. Take a look at those again. For those of you who before too long will be doing your student teaching and will be having to pass the PPAT in order to get your final certification, you need to be very, very aware of all of those different types of instruction. Look at them again. Active learning, where the kids aren't just passively listening to you talk. Active learning, where you are planning activities for them to go along with the subject that's being taught. Especially for those of you who are early childhood, you know children learn through play. So that's very important that there is active learning for children in your classroom. Social interaction, it's really hard right now, I know, with the pandemic going on. If kids are online, their social interaction is more likely to take place in the home between brothers and sisters than it is outside the home. But a lot of learning comes from social interaction. When we talk about authentic activities, anytime that we talk about authentic activities this semester, you know I'm going to be talking about actual doing activities in the classroom, actual activities that have to do with using good, solid children's trade books that they enjoy reading, good, solid experiences for connecting to what the children are familiar with. Your strategy instruction, we're going to be talking about so many strategies this semester. But then again, I want to point out that on your syllabus, I ask that you not just have the reading textbook, but to also buy the Saravallo Reading Strategies book. I want you to go in to teaching well equipped with a whole arsenal of strategies for teaching reading, and this really is one of the best books that I've ever seen. I've talked with Miss Snell about it. It's one of the best ones she's ever used. That the students can be learning from. They're easy to put together activities that don't require a whole lot of preparation. And knowing all of those different strategies is going to come back to help you regardless of whether you're teaching reading or any subject. And I know I'll be mentioning it a lot this semester, but it'll also come back to help you a lot with your PPAT. Individualization. Whenever we talk about individualization, some people like to think that that is a bad word, but it is not. Individualized instruction is simply making sure that you know your students well enough that you can more individualize the instruction that they need to help them with whatever problem that they have. We're going to be coming back to that a lot this semester. With individualized instruction, you really are doing what you are supposed to be doing and preparing all your students if at all possible. And the inquiry learning, there is kind of where the taking ownership jumps back in again. Because if you are getting the students to actually take part in inquiry learning, if you get the students to actually take part in asking their own questions and trying to come up with solutions to their own questions through their reading and so forth, that will help them take good control of their own learning. Teacher quality is the most important factor in determining how well students learn. Bummer, huh? That's where, I'm sorry, it's a huge responsibility, but teacher quality is the single biggest factor on determining how well young students learn. And so that's one of the reasons I've been telling you ever since Foundations, if you had me in Foundations, that it truly is such an important job that you all are going to be doing. You have to take it seriously. It can't just be oh, I can wing it kind of production. It can't just be, oh, I think the kids are going to like me so much that they'll learn from me, no matter what. No, that's wrong. So teacher quality will be right now in your preparation for becoming a teacher. So think on that, please. Think on that. Also, our text breaks effective instruction down into 9 different principles, and we're referring back to that. For example, effective teachers understand how students learn. And as I mentioned earlier, the book goes back a lot to some things that you may have touched on in some of your other classes, but it kind of goes into it even deeper. If you will look on this, there's a chart on page 7 that I would like for you to mark or be able to come back to, because it covers those learning theories that you were introduced to way back in Foundations that you thought you could forget about after it was all over with. But it goes back to those learning theories that really and truly are what set you apart from just pulling in a warm body off of the sidewalk outside. You understand how students learn. you understand that there really are methods behind the madness. So if you get a chance, go back and look at that. There's even a lot of information back on page 5 from the National Board of Professional Teaching Standards that talk about characteristics of effective teachers that I would hope that you'd come back to. And right now, like I said, we're talking about how we understand how students learn. Well, we understand that there are theories that inform our teaching. Like I said, methods behind the madness. Principle number 2, if you'll look at it, has to do with knowledge about literacy. And looking on page 12 in your book, it breaks down things like cueing systems. We're going to be referring back to cueing systems a lot. Effective teachers know about cueing systems, and we support the students' use of them. For example, we've got things like phonics, anything from the phonological system, where we know about sounds. We know about regional differences. We know that in our system of speaking, for example, there are 44 different sounds. 44 different sounds that we teach children. And when we're talking about 44 different sounds, that we call that the phonological sound system, but we take those 44 different sounds, and in our country we use them more than 500 ways. That's kind of crazy, but it's true. Like I said, if you move to any different part of the country, you're going to be hearing words even pronounced differently. So we take those 44 basic sounds and we use them over 500 different ways. When we're talking about cueing systems, especially like the phonological cueing systems, we're studying about things like morphemes. Remember, morphemes are the smallest meaningful unit of a word, smallest meaningful unit of sound. And if you look back at that chart on page 12, there is so much information on that chart, so much information between pages 12 and 13 on the phonological system that I'm really hoping that you'll go back to. The terms like phonemes, graphemes, morphemes that I mentioned earlier, those are all terms that you need to go through. This chapter you need to go through, you need to highlight them and be able to come back to them before you, for example, take your OSAT. Because whether you're taking the early childhood, especially if you're taking the early childhood, but even if you're taking the elementary to a certain extent, you've got to know those terms because they're going to come back to haunt you whenever you're taking those tests. This particular chapter goes back to a lot on the theories that I mentioned earlier. If we're talking about constructivism, you might remember the word schema or even Piaget. Whenever we're talking about schema, we know that, I always use this in foundations, that our minds are like a mental filing cabinet, and whenever you are teaching, a lot of times you might be teaching things that maybe the kids have heard before, but they they know them well enough they can connect to them, so they're just mentally filing them away in the files that they've already created. But when we're talking about student-centered theories, you're always going to hear the term ZPD, or zone of proximal development. And when you hear that, you know that we're talking about making a whole new file. The best learning comes from whenever the students they're still sort of comfortable, but yet you're knocking them off high center just a little bit, because they go, I think I know what she's talking about, but I'm not sure. They're queuing in, and they're actually having to create a whole new file in their mental filing cabinet. And they do that through developing, we call it, new schema. There's a lot on that between pages 6 to 8. There's a lot on sociolinguistics between pages 8 and 9. Information processing theory between pages 10 and 11, and behaviorism on page 6. One more time, just so that you do remember. The student-centered theories are the first 3 that we've got up here. The teacher-centered theory is the behaviorism. When we're talking about constructivism, just one last quick overview. It is active construction of knowledge. It is actively creating that schema in their brains. It is things like using literature focus units that you're going to be creating for this class. It is doing things like graphic organizers, like KWL charts or something. It is having kids write and respond in reading logs about what is being read, making the connection from here to actually here. It is about doing thematic units, which literature focus units, thematic units are actually pretty close. We refer to them a lot more as thematic units the younger the kids are. And there is also a really good connection of constructivism in the classroom when you are exposing students to multicultural literature. If you think back to your children's lit class, whether you had it with me or not, there's a really, really good multicultural book list on page 9 I'd kind of like for you to keep in mind there. With sociolinguistics, that's critical literacy. If you hear the term critical literacy at any given time on your exams or PPAT or anything, we're talking about sociolinguistics. Think back to Vygotsky, the name Vygotsky. Whenever he said that we need to give students opportunities to like talk with their peers, or to like collaborate, to actually do things that are more social related. This semester you'll hear me talking a lot about using literature circles or partner reading, or a lot on reading and writing workshop. And if I'm talking about any of that, you know that that is collaboration with the students. I've been seeing just recently a lot of creative ways that teachers have been doing with their online classes when it comes to like reading and writing workshop. The author's chair idea or strategy is a really good thing to use here with sociolinguistics. By the way, a lot of the time whenever I say things like literature circles, reading and writing workshop, author's chair, all of these different strategies are also or explained or defined in the back of your book in the addendum. It is brilliant. If you don't keep any other part of the book from this course, I would run off every bit of the addendum at the back that has all the activities. But we're going to be coming back to those this semester as well. The information processing theory. Whenever we're talking about that, that is when people consider the mind to be kind of like a computer. It's very process oriented. You will hear terms such as, or see terms even in this chapter 1, like interactive model of reading or writing, interactive reading lesson, interactive writing lesson. There are YouTube videos, scads of them out there that you can look up that where you actually see these being done in a classroom. And anytime you see anything that has interactive in it, it goes back to the information processing theory. The transactive theory of reading by Rosenblum, that it's mentioned in this particular chapter. Strategic behaviors are covered in this particular chapter. Whenever you are doing things with your class where you are leading them through something very systematic, like guided reading or using those graphic organizers or reading logs, that's all a part of getting them to be very processing oriented. Thinking about your own thoughts, metacognition, is a lot of times referred to a lot under the information processing theory. Then we have behaviorism. Remember B.F. Skinner from a long time ago? Remember terms like explicit instruction? It is very teacher controlled, and it's very reward motivated, you know, rewards and punishments actually. When we're talking about using the basals, the basal readers that are often bought for schools, not as often anymore because the money's not there, but the reading textbooks, having to work out of workbooks, whole class instruction, that's all considered behaviorism. It sees the teacher as being the provider of information, and the student's role is being a little bit more passive than in some of the other types of learning that we're going to talk a lot about this semester. Principle 3 talks about characteristics of a classroom community of learners. You need to be a student of your students. Right off the bat, you need to use interest inventories, get to know your students, some way, somehow, get to know what your students likes, what their dislikes. For goodness sake, know where they come from. Know who has siblings, know who has outside activities, know who goes home to an empty house possibly in the evenings. Be a student of your students. Make sure you get to know them. This will come back to haunt you again even whenever you're taking your PPAT as well, because you are going to do interest inventories with your students as part of your beginning PPAT activities. The fourth thing that we're going to be talking about is a balanced approach to instruction. There's a really good chart on page 18 for you to look back at, but balanced approach to reading is going to be really important to you even on the quiz that you take over this chapter. Pages 16 to 19 in your book covers the balanced approach to reading. There's an essay question on it this week in our quizzes, by the way. A balanced approach to reading is, it requires a lot of flexibility on your part. It is actually an art, if you want to call it that. It includes reading fiction, it includes reading nonfiction, it includes reading different types of genres, different mediums. Um, it involves new literacies, that like the technology, because you'll hear me talking about new literacies all semester long. It involves the strategies and the skills that you use to teach with. How much emphasis is put on talking with each other and discussing and responding, the oral language end of reading, vocabulary development, working on comprehension, writing, spelling. A balanced approach isn't just all explicit instruction. A balanced approach includes all of those other activities, types of activities, whether they are authentic or inquiry learning or strategic or anything like that, all rolled into one. And as I said, pages 16 to 19 in your book, you'll get a lot of information on that. If you are going to be wanting to get help with seeing what we're talking about in here actually in connection to what's being taught in the schools, on your Blackboard and in this PowerPoint, I've included a direct link into the English Language Arts Standards for the state of Oklahoma. Notice this says 2016. They are currently in the works of updating this, but right now this is what they've still got on the State Department website. A lot of times, including whenever you're putting together your own units, I'm going to be asking you to refer back to different grade levels and what is being taught in relation to like vocabulary or comprehension with the different grade levels throughout elementary. So keep this in mind. Get to become acquainted with your English Language Arts Standards from the State Department. The sixth item that we're going to be talking about is that effective teachers learn how to scaffold. And between pages 22 and 24, you're going to see a lot about this. For example, on modeled reading and writing, do you remember whenever I mentioned earlier about interactive reading and writing? There's a lot about interactive reading and writing when it comes to the modeled reading and writing that this particular part of your chapter talks about. There's going to be, by the way, a time when I'm going to be asking all of you when we have our actual face-to-face time to be able to like go through the steps of an interactive reading or writing lesson, and there will be an essay question on that on your midterm too, by the way. That's on page 22 if you want to look back at it. The shared or partner reading and writing that we've mentioned earlier is page 23. The guided reading and writing, which is more processed linguistics oriented, is also on page 23. And then the independent reading and writing is on page 24, where they're talking about how good teachers scaffold all of these different levels of learning to read and write. When we're talking about scaffolding, teachers scaffold by providing opportunities in several different ways. If you are ever asked a question, whether it is in your multiple choice on your OSAT that you take, that includes the reading and writing end for the elementary or for the early childhood, these are the different ways that teachers scaffold for students. They scaffold by giving their students very explicit instruction. They scaffold by the give and take, the oral language development, remember that I talked about, the response. They scaffold by small group work, that's social interaction. They scaffold by read alouds, where the students are seeing it modeled correctly and they're hearing it and they're learning to enjoy it. They are scaffolding by building background knowledge, which goes back to constructivism over and over and over again, and those authentic literacy activities like using good children's literature or setting up your class into a reading and writing workshop type format, or even going through using thematic units or literature units with your classes. You've got to remember that scaffolding involves 5 different levels. And whenever we're talking about the 5 different levels of scaffolding, it's all about the modeling, the sharing, the interactive, the guided, the independent, and so forth. Just remember to come back to these over and over and over again at any given time throughout the rest of your program when it comes to you're being told to be sure to scaffold your activities. With the 7th point, organizing for literacy instruction, just remember this. We're going to be talking so much about these different terms. That's one of the reasons they're all introduced in Chapter 1. But remember that when we're going back to these, the literature focus units, the literature circles, the reading workshop, the writing workshop, those are all, remember, what we consider to be student-centered. The basal readers, the literature anthologies, or the specialty textbooks, those are always what we consider to be more like behavioral theory or teacher-centered. There is a lot on the organizing for literacy instruction between pages 25 to 26. There's going to also be several videos available for you to watch from our Blackboard that will cover these different topics that, or different terms, whatever you want to call it, that is introduced, thrown at you in this particular chapter, because there's a lot. Principle number 8. We know that effective teachers differentiate. We mentioned earlier they individualize. I would like for you to look at pages 28 to 29 about how they differentiate. Anytime that you are asked about differentiation in the classroom, remember that teachers differentiate 3 different ways. This is probably what will come back to haunt you on your OSAT. They differentiate by the content, the process, and the product. The content, actually what they are using, what kind of tools, whether they're using trade books or textbooks or so forth, what kind of materials that they have on hand they're using. They differentiate the process, like how they go about it, the strategy that they take in order to teach their students in such a way that they're meeting their needs, and we identify their needs through assessment, and that's another chapter, but because assessment drives instruction, we'll be talking about that later. But they also differentiate the product, what they're actually wanting to get out of the whole process of whatever lesson that they're teaching. There is an absolutely fantastic chart on page 30 that I would ask for you to come back to, that I think will help you over and over again when it talks about how teachers differentiate instruction. And finally, I mentioned earlier on the last slide about classroom assessment in the reading classroom. We link assessment and instruction because the assessment drives our instruction. How or what we find out, the data that we get from assessing our students, knowing where our students are, is how or what we use in order to design our lessons. You have to learn about your students' reading levels through different reading inventories that you do, especially early on in the school year, but you continue to do them throughout the year in order to see growth. You constantly monitor your students' progress. You're paying attention to whether or not they are advancing. You're always trying to diagnose their strengths and their weaknesses. You're going to get so much of this in diagnosis of reading difficulties with Mrs. Snell. If you're not already in that class this semester, you'll probably be taking it next semester. But that is so very important. So many teachers, they just poo-poo that, but they can't. You can't poo-poo the diagnosing their strengths and their weaknesses. That's a part of getting to know your students. That's a part of getting to know exactly what the medicine is that you're going to be dispensing to them. And you've got to reflect on that and document it and keep your own notes and make sure you have a file on each of your students so that you can come back and try to figure out exactly what you're needing to do to help that kid out. Not to mention, whenever you have those files on hand, you'll be referring back to them over and over again when you're talking with the parents if you're having parent-teacher conferences. That's going to be about everything that you need to know when it comes to covering this first chapter. I will be getting with you during this whole process to see what kinds of questions you might have that we can all kind of talk and discuss out. And I hope you do real well on the first quiz. Chapter 1 is a bit daunting because it just throws so much at you at one time. But it's good stuff because we're going to be coming back to it so often during the semester. I wish you well. Glad you're here.